Did I ever tell you about Frankie? The Conversation by George Fitzgerald, Book 3. I was 12 when I got my first summer job. I worked for John, who was the boss of a Finglas crew. They were roofers. John got me in my first fight in Drimna Boxing Club in the summer of the same year. I won. On my first day on the job, I cried. I sat on the roof that was, for me, 1,000,000 miles from the ground and so far from Finglas I didn't know where I was. There was no silence here. Everything was loud and noisy as men shouted to men, and I crouched at the side of a chimney on the roof with no tiles. I wasn't afraid. I was in disbelief. It was a beautiful morning, and at some point I thought, we must not be getting a break because surely it's time for me to go home and to me ma. When I asked the roofer, he said, "What? No, it's nearly 10. We'll be getting a cup of tea in a few minutes." He winked. And I thought it was nearly 5. And he said it was 10. And I bawled my eyes out at the thought of it all. He was right. At 10, I found myself in a smelly canteen, listening to the carpenters with posh voices, that much I knew, telling jokes not fit for little boys' ears. Men drank tea from milk bottles and jars. There were old newspapers, stale bread crusts, dry tea bags on the floor, and dead flies on a table where a man just brushed them off with the hand he held the sandwich in. And John cut in on the jokers and said, pointing to me, "He's only a kid." The carpenter looked at John. Then he ran his eyes across our crew, and he sat. And I thought, sometimes it's good to come from Finglas. In September I went back to school. The next time I entered a building site was around 1980, when I started my apprenticeship as a plasterer. They called it Boys Town because Charlie Higgins, a referee in the National Boxing Stadium, got us all jobs there, and I was one of them. From there I moved from one building job to another. So, by 2002, I was accustomed to construction sites, as they call them in America. The thing about building sites in the wintertime is spelled in one word: hardship. The sites are very harsh environments to work in, but the winter can make it much more difficult. There's the cold and the wind and the rain, and in those days the sound of the dumper and the kango hammers and the muck and the mud and the dirt seems to add to the trials. And a lot of weather-beaten men who, by all accounts, wasn't only the weather that was beating them, the wheels of time change. As boys grow in these places to men and inherit the same common interests, I suppose, the horses, the drink and the women. The dirt I mentioned above was not only beneath the feet, but some men carried it wherever they went. There are so many stories and so many tales. They come from the good, the bad and everyone in between. Some stories go over your head and others fall beneath your feet, but one story came to me that would never live. It would have an influence on me. It came to me on an inner city building site in 2002. A story we'll get back to shortly. I wasn't a theologian or a founding member of some new ministry. However, from the then present account that I was told and ones that came later, I was fronting an explosive, impacting outreach, not only in my neighbourhood, but basically wherever I went. It was simple. People were in need. We had the answer. The simple gospel message, Christ and Christ alone for salvation. The cell group meeting that we were involved in my house had grown. Joseph, my late twin brother, had taken over another one and started in his own house. We were reaching people with the gospel. There was that time, in real time, when Jesus turned up every time, and I preached everywhere I went. This was an explosive, revolutionary, I suppose, impacting type of revival, because the people from the city, the people from the neighbourhoods, the people from homegrown were coming to Christ. Brand new, born again, spirit-filled people who had never heard the gospel before and were coming in to the revelation of who Jesus was. Let's go back to the inner city site and the canteen and what took place there in a day in June in 2002. Now the men on the side, they looked like they'd stepped from Blackbeard's boat. The pirate that roamed the seven seas. Remember that guy? They were rough and tough, using coarse language, shouting at one another with their mouths full of half-eaten bread. When break time called for us to sit down at our tools, as I took up my customary position by sitting in the canteen, quietly reading my Bible. What started with a question turned into a church service of a different type. They are waiting for me daily as I walked into the old canteen. Roy, what do you mean Jesus is Lord when he never lived? Asked one man. Oh, he lived all right and died, but he never rose, said another. Here, George, if there is a God, why is there so much evil in the world? Answer, that boss of the no hair crew. Ha 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 ha! This guy burst out laughing, so did the others, but I didn't. He looked at me and I returned the look with a sheepish reply. He said, only joking. Let's turn your question on its head. If there is a God, what are we going to say to him for causing so much evil in the world, his world, the one he created? And on it went. Question upon question, but I gave the answer. I walked up and down preaching the word. There was not one of them who could outwit me, not one could outcatch me. As soon as a question came, the answer was delivered. It was a clear morning in Dublin, the type you don't forget when everything seems to be right in the world. And I was back on site at a half-finished building, the air thick with the smells of wet concrete, oil, blocks, the general odours that lodge in the air on these building sites, and the clang of steel wielding and the cherry picker beeping and the shouts from men hanging off scaffolds and walking the ground. And I was pacing along the edge of the site and headed towards the canteen with my Bible in hand. The workers had gathered behind me and they all took their seats. Some of them bemused. They had those expressions, and others narrowed their eyes in scepticism. And I said, brothers, I'll tell you, the kingdom of God is at hand. It's not in the plans like these buildings. I pointed to the window. Or in the steel beams you're setting up. But it's in your heart. I pointed towards them. A few of them sniggered, shaking their heads. One of them, Sean, a burly man with a thick beard, leaned on a shovel and called out, "What's this, George? Preaching, what? Are you a pastor or a priest?" Everyone laughed. I raised my voice, a fire ignited in my chest. "Sean, what's greater? If your heart is hollow and your souls are empty, it's easy to get lost in the grind of this world. But there is something far more important than all of this. If your only reward comes on Friday, what are you going to do on a Sunday? See, there was another Friday and a different Sunday." Sean's expression shifted from mockery to irritation. "What's that supposed to mean, George? We don't need your sermon. We need a few bob and a good woman." And I won't repeat what he said. There was laughing and cheering. But I was undeterred. I moved towards him, noticing the gunslinger stare. I was only a kid when I bumped into people like you. He could see the intensity in my eyes. I know he did, because he turned his head. "No, Sean. It's not just about money and all that. It's not about what you're building on the outside. It's about what you're building on the inside. What are you constructing, my friend? A life that's worth living, or just another day to day, clock in, clock out, listen to men, have jokes, talk that rubbish? And that's your life. There is only one God. And there is only one way. And that way is found in no other but the person of Jesus. You can go to popes, you can go to priests, you can even go to pastors and bishops and whoever you want. You can go to theological school, you can go to all these places. Not that any of you men will, but the reality is, what I'm simply pointing to is, there is no saint you can kneel to. There's nobody. There's only the one person, and that person is called Jesus. He is the singular, most powerful human being that ever crossed the planet. He walked out of the pages of the history books of human and brought an experience that nobody else can. He is the King of Kings and He is the Lord of Lords. He is the supreme ruler over everything. Silence. My gaze swept over them, catching their eyes one by one. You see, I continued, the greatest builder of them all is the one who laid the foundations of the earth. He's calling to you, but it's your choice whether you hear him. You pile up those bricks and blocks and build up those towers of stone, but if you don't build a solid foundation on His love, faith and hope, then all you've got is a crumbling building. Together they stood asking questions and shouting insults. One man stormed out. Now in the corner was an aged man, an aged inner city man. Although he seemed too old to be walking, he was still there. Well, he didn't really walk, he made the thing clean around. I gazed at him as he held a brush. Suddenly I pointed in his direction and said, "Frankie, Jesus loves you." I came to a moment where I looked out the window and saw a tree in the middle of a sight, old, mature, standing so proud. Beyond that was the side of the building leading to the old cobbled streets. The sun was out, but it put its overcoat on when it went around to the side of that building. A memory came to me when I saw Joe, Bella, Thomas and me as kids rambling on those cobbled streets. Questions came at me then, like left, right and right hooks and uppercuts. They came at me from here, there and everywhere. I answered them, every one of them. I stood back watching them all argue. The horn rang out and we went back to work. 1 hour later I decided to make coffee. This would have been frowned upon, but who was going to tell me not to? I had a sand and cement wall on. It was too soft to rub up, so I had to wait. The way I saw it was, wait here or there, in the canteen, with a chair and a coffee. The chair and the coffee were the better option. I entered the canteen and the light rushed in, like the way the rays of the sun burst upon the earth awakening the morning. Behind me the noise travelled. It was the sound of men roaring kango hammers playing that old tune, rat-a-tat-tat. I closed the door and allowed that distant sound to remain where it should be, distant. Frankie made a cup of tea. I made a coffee. Frankie, to my mind, was close to 70. How was he still walking? I don't know. Or maybe he was younger. He just looked older and I got it wrong. Frankie stood about 5'6". He was of thin build, having a full mop of hair, brown, greying at the sides. He had all the hallmarks of an ex-prize fighter or somebody who had seen the inside of a cell in his younger days. He was not inner city red, definitely. Furthermore, he had a rough exterior and that old Dublin brogue. He took a comb out of his trouser pocket and ran it through his hair. It was wild. Then he reached inside his jacket and took out a pair of glasses and put them on. They were like sort of John Lennon glasses. He pretended to read a paper. I sensed the avoidance. He was avoiding me. The only sound was of him turning the pages of a well-read paper that he probably pulled out of a bin. The morning light had gone to bed. Well, hadn't really gone to bed. It was sleepy, but it was waning. Old Father Time, sitting on his rocking chair, watching the humans waste a lot of what was given to them. I fired a sideways glance at him. He knew I did that. Frankie folded the paper and removed his glasses. Yeah, Georgie, you know all that stuff about Jesus? Yeah, I said, sipping the coffee. He looked at me. I returned the favour, and there was this pause. I don't want to know about Jesus. The emphasis was on the name. It wasn't only an irritation, but I could sense the offence. His tone was aggressive. Well, there's a surprise. And here I was, half thinking you were going to be a priest. His eyes darted around, imagining that someone was listening, a habit I suspected. I looked out the window at the men walking and said, if you're worrying about them guys, nothing to do with them. What's it to do with? I asked, taking another sup, while he rolled a cigarette. He stared into space, like one of those stares of if he was taking a good long look at his own reflection in the mirror. Or maybe an oil painting of his youth that was once so fresh you could smell the paint. His cheeks reddened, and his gaze was on a search. I'd seen those eyes a million times before. Same eyes, different people. Same expression, different face. Same atmosphere, different place. The eyes at the window to the soul. What I saw was a man who was numb, indifferent, disengaged from the world that simply didn't care. He was away somewhere in his mind, on a stroll perhaps, a timeless moment caught in his memory, the little boy he once was, and the Dublin's no longer here. I wondered what it was he saw, and if he saw it, could he tell us? Ordinarily I would say, penny for them, Frankie. I left a moment to him and thought about the men and my childhood places. The fields, the river, the birds, in the sky. I saw the rocking chair my mother once bought, and out of nowhere Frankie cut in and said, I was in Letterfrack, Georgie. Chapter 2. He blew a mouthful of smoke into the air. He repeated the action, stubbed it out and rolled another cigarette. There are those times when I count things in my head, like chairs in a room, water at a table, a bird in the sky, a leaf falling from a tree, 10 men in front, 3 men behind. How far is the moon? Does the sun have friends? I take out a pencil and draw a little picture. I write a little line, sometimes I sing a song. In those fragmented few seconds, all I could say to myself was, I got it, Frankie. No more need to be said. And I repeated, Letterfrack, over in my mind. And I remember as a kid running with another kid, and he said, if they catch me, they'll send me to Letterfrack. And I said, Letterfrack is gone. St. Joseph's Industrial School, Letterfrack, was built in 1886 and 1887. It was run by the Congregation of Christian Brothers. By the time Frankie arrived, it received a lasting notoriety. True, whispering tales and physical and sexual abuse of boys. It was deemed to be one of the worst industrial schools in the country. And given that they were all houses of horror, it was not a title it could really boast in. From the day the doors opened until it closed in 1974, 100 boys died in its care. And obviously Frankie wasn't one of them, but he could have been. They died in their care. What? How did care kill them? Frankie gave a little spit and pulled a loose tobacco from his bottom lip. I sipped the coffee. He stubbed out the cigarette and rolled another and placed it behind his ear. He went to the kettle and made a cup of tea, and I thought to myself, I'd say he grew up on it, buckets of tea. He walked towards me, cup in hand, placed it on the table, looked directly at me and said, do you know why I don't want to believe all that stuff? Go on, tell me. Frankie pulled the chair back. It made a screeching sound. Then he placed his hands under it and inched forward. took the cup and gave a little sip. I'm a tenement kid who was sent away by a judge in the courtroom in an uproar as me ma was fit to be tied. I was only a little boy when they hauled me across the country, approximately 190 miles. I was only a little boy. Those words painted a picture so vivid I could see it. The overcrowding tenement houses, the cobbled streets, the washing hanging from the windows, the kids in caps playing ball barefooted while the women pushed our prams, and the boy in court lost alone amidst so many faces that were uncaring, angry and judgmental. His screams echoed throughout the building as his mother was held back by outstretched hands. "Ah, Francis! Ah, me son, Francis!" But they fell on deaf ears. If she knew what was ahead of him, I'm sure she would have cried all the more. He took the rollie from his ear, lit it, and continued. Georgie, when them doors of Letterfrack closed, I knew I was never going to be the same. I was there for only about a year, and the winter was the worst. In the dormer beds, boys snoring, crying, others fearfully whimpering under their blankets, and the sound of the door opening and closing. Away, me and a guy called Limerick John decided to make a run for it. We both went into a room. We saw the kid as thin as a twig, with eyes that were black and blue and almost closed. He looked like the rest of us, starving. And when he turned, we could see that he'd soiled himself. We watched him grope the wall, crying, until a brother came in and gave him a slap across the face and shut him up. One day, Limerick John and I ran. Once we got far enough away, we walked out and walked through grassland and down lanes and dirt tracks. We saw the man in the distance walking in a field full of cows and boys our age swimming in a river. So we stuck up and stole their clothes and fled. We came across a house with whitewashed walls and clothes hanging on lines. Limerick John and I snuck up and peeked in the window at a country woman ironing the clothes. There was bread in a basket, slices of cheese, buns and jam. Limerick John tapped the window and the woman chased him out with the broom, so I ran inside and grabbed bread, cheese and 2 homemade buns. We passed the odd house that looked like no one had lived in it since the famine. And if someone did, they must have been very poor, even poorer than us. There was a lot of us there in Letterfrack, Dublin boys. Then we came across this little cottage on a narrow road. A couple was standing in the garden. They watched us with very suspicious eyes. I heard the woman say, "These are the Dublin boys." She repeated, "They're Dublin boys." The man said something in Irish, put the brush up against the wall and went inside. A tall man came out the door, hair as white as snow. He looked like a corpse. Limerick John said, he said something about the Christian brothers. "That much I know, Frankie," although he didn't say in a Dublin accent. So we ran as fast as we could. We came to this spot. That was the most breathtaking place a boy from Dublin could wish to see. See, you must remember in our day, Georgie, the clouds and the smoke and the chimneys. The sky was black most of the time. But here, it was all hills and valleys and lakes. So that night we stayed there, sleeping under the open sky, Limerick John and me. The next day, hungry, cold and alone, we trekked what must have been about 4 or 5 miles. What we didn't know was we were making our way back, not making our way out. Then we found a narrow road and we saw it. The guarded car coming towards us. We were too tired to run, so we sat in the grass and waited. The door opened and 2 tall uniformed men stepped out. They looked on us kindly and helped us up, telling us how worried their brothers were for our safety and all, and how they longed for their return. That's the impression they gave, greeting us as we stepped out of that car. But all the other boys looking out the window and the ones that were surrounding them at the doorway had different views on their faces. Their faces told us a different story, the one we already knew. But these were tender, almost loving, rubbing our heads and kissing our foreheads. But once we were inside, they beat us within an inch of our lives. And beat us and beat us. We are made to stand in our own urine, an excrement in a corner, battered black and blue with cuts in our lips and black eyes and a bucket of cold water on our heads and told not to move. Otherwise the water would spill over us, we'd be drenched. See, one day, as the brothers beat me, Georgie, I saw it. They beat me in my own blood. I saw it. You saw what, Frankie? I saw the cross hanging from the brother's neck as he grinded his teeth with saliva spilling from his mouth. I wiped the blood from my own busted lip, and there it was, the cross. And I wondered and thought, why am I here? Why were you there, Frankie? Did you rob a shop? No. I robbed a loaf of bread from a baker. You're a nice fella, Georgie. One of our own. But I've seen enough of crosses and listened to Christian brothers. In the silence, we shared a glance. I knew what he was thinking. No quick answer. No comeback, Georgie. He was wrong. I had. But why win the battle and lose the war? The hour is his, not mine. Mourn with those who mourn was the only reply needed here, and I needed to show that. I respected him. But time was moving on, and I had a wall to rub. So clapping the table, I said as I stood, "Okay, Frankie. I respect you, and I get it." Once I reached the door, I took hold of the handle and turned. "Frankie, it's a pity those so-called brothers will get off for it on the day of judgment. Get off how? There's no witnesses." I was using a human court setting to draw him out. Of course, they would not get off for it. They knew not Christ. "I'm the witness." It's amazing what he believed now, isn't it? I thought. "What? I'm the witness." "No, you're not." I let go of the handle and walked towards him. "See, Frankie, you're on their side. Therefore, there is no witness. On that day, when the charge is read out in the holy courts of God, when billions upon billions of angels and every human being that has ever lived and all mankind is there at that judgment hall, there will be no witness to be found. When that whole scene comes up on the big screens, there will still be no witness. Silence." He bowed his head as if he knew he wasn't only being robbed in this life but possibly in the next. And compassion walked in. But compassion was accompanied by grace. Here in this place, the shaven-head man from Finglas, the chiefest of sinners among singers, was sent at this very appointed time, on that hour, in that day, to deliver that message of salvation to the tenement boy whose life was broken and beaten by men who called themselves Christian. "Frankie, if you're not on Jesus' side, you're on theirs," he said softly. "You need to forgive them. They set bars on your heart, but God can set you free." "Forgive them?" cut in with eyes burning like fire. I knew that was nearly impossible. I knew I'd have a difficulty finding that forgiveness for those men, let alone him. But I repeated, forgive them. See, forgiveness was the thing that was holding him. Forgive. Listen, Frankie, listen to me. If you go to God, not to men, you've seen what men can do. Holy men, righteous men, you can see what they can do. But if you go to God and God alone, this very night, and ask him to help you, grace will meet you there. Ask Jesus to come in to be your Lord and Saviour. That's what you need to do, Frankie. And on that note, I had to leave. I rubbed the wall I was walking on, but I couldn't get Frankie out of my head. The next day, I entered the canteen to an uproar of questions. Then my name was called from outside. The door was open and a man said, "George Fitzgerald, yeah, grab your tools, there's a plaster needed and another job." I watched Frankie make his way towards me. I wondered what it was he was going to say. Goodbye, or other words he might have said. Did he take anything I did say to him seriously? I nearly counted the steps as he was coming towards me, and then he stood there right in front of me and said, "I said it." He said, "What, Frankie?" "I said that prayer last night, Georgie. I said that prayer and asked Jesus to be my Lord and God." He said that in front of all the men, who suddenly felt silent and took a step back, as if they understood there was a moment here. I took hold of his hands and looked into his eyes. They were full of peace. His countenance had changed. The old song, "Irish eyes are smiling." I'll see you on that day, Frankie. We embraced, and I never did see him again. But we did pray for him in that cell group in Finglas South, Dublin 11. And he became the inspiration for me when I took on the journey of telling tales and writing stories in books. He became the inspiration. Frankie, the broken life. And so many others, and so many people across this city who'd experienced so many other things. As kids, we knew what Letterfrack was, and Dangan, and Artane, St. Lawrence's, and Finglas. Dublin kids did. Because there'd been history of boys being sent away. Frankie's life was broken. He was cast out because a starving little kid stole a loaf of bread. And he paid for that dearly through his entire life. But there was that point of time when I walked into that canteen. That was an appointed time, because the very next day I was gone. The message of the gospel had reached him.